good. It's so nice to see you this evening. Thank you very much for coming. We're thrilled to have you. My name is Stephanie Plunkett. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator, and it's really been a thrill to have Hanna-Barbera, the architects of Saturday Morning, on view this, well, since November. It's just, I think, created such interest from all facets of the community. And we've been very fortunate to have many masters of the animation art form with us, including Fred Seibert, who's here as a visitor this evening, but he gave a wonderful talk recently. And tonight we're very fortunate to have Arlen Schumer with us for his program, which is called The Flintstones, Anatomy of a Pop Culture Classic. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about his background because he is a great historian. Arlen Schumer is an award-winning comic book style illustrator for the advertising and editorial markets. He's also an author and designer of richly illustrated art books, including The Silver Age of Comic Book Art, which we do have here this evening. And that book won the Independent Book Publishers Award for Best Popular Culture Book. A recognized expert on American popular culture, especially the legendary television series The Twilight Zone.
Not the Flintstones?
The Flintstones, which you, of course, are going to hear a lot about this evening, and maybe already have, actually. And the music of Bruce Springsteen, so an interesting combination of elements. Arlen presents visual lectures on these and other subjects at universities and cultural institutions across America. And his illustration clients include Mars Candy, Idaho Potatoes, HBO, the WNBA, and many others. So welcome, Arlen. We're very happy to have you, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, am I mic'd up? Are we ready to go techno-wise? Yes, okay. Normally, you know, I have the lights out. I love in a dark room, but we're going to be here fully lit. But I want to thank you all for being here. Let me just have a sip of water, and then we'll start proper.
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. They're a modern Stone Age family. Hello, Fred and Wilma. They're a couple just like you and me.
Dino is our little dinosaur. He's good, but nobody knows what for.
When you meet the Flintstones, have a
Yabba dabba do time, a dabba do time.
you'll have a gay old time.
You might be wondering what that song is. It's not familiar to you. You know, look how the Flintstones over time kept adding family members. Until finally you got Bam Bam and the whole crew. But I happen to like the original four, before they had the kids, which we'll get into later. And it's this image that I used to create the invitation for the promotion of this event that I'm very grateful for the Rockwell Museum to have me there in what I call the Flintstones Anatomy of a Pop Culture Classic. And my name is Arlen Schumer. Let's continue with the song you've never heard.
Barney and his Betty, they're as neighborly as they can be.
Barney, I'm Fred's bosom buddy friend.
As long as he has a buck to lend.
When you're with the Rubbles, have
A scooba dooba doo time, a dooba doo time.
you'll have a gay old time.
Okay, let's get it out of the way first. We'll have a gay all time. Could it be that the Flintstones are gay, as this poster from sometime in the 1990s shows? I mean, Fred and Barney, could they be gay? I mean, we know from the evidence that, sure, they embraced a lot, and sometimes those embraces, you know, would lead to a little physical contact, which of course Fred didn't want to kiss and tell, and yeah, okay, sometimes they did wind up in bed together, but every 50s couple wound up in bed together. And yes, men, they like to dance together every now and then. What's wrong with expressing a little physical contact? Okay, sometimes they took a little far. Okay, they like to dress up, but okay, it's only on stage. But, you know, all the great cartoon characters used to dress up. I mean, come on. There were how many Bugs Bunny cartoons? So we could excuse Fred and Barney if every now and then they like to dress up. But really, their friendship was a lot deeper than that, almost bordering on an existential male friendship that only us men can really understand. Now, Wilma and Betty, as you can see from this poster, I mean, come on, yes, they too were close friends that would express physical contact, but they were deep friends. They laughed together, they cried together, and just like Fred and Barney, they also performed and liked to dance, and they too liked to dress up. But again, their friendship was a deep female bonding that all the women can totally identify with. So yes, the Flintstones, gay? Okay, they like to do a couple of weird, don't even ask me what, this image is about. But I think if you asked the Flintstones if they were gay, I think they would all just laugh at a poster like this. But the reason why I show this is that it just shows you how deeply the Flintstones have penetrated American pop culture. Both high, as in the New York Times crossword puzzle, and this is still high art. This is Kenny Scharf, the great fine artist from 1982. You've got the Flintstones imitated on other cartoon shows like Family Guy. We'll be seeing a lot of that a little later. And of course, the mother of all animated shows, which wouldn't be possible without the Flintstones, was of course the Simpsons. We've had the Flintstones in both live action movies and now being treated realistically, like I was talking about before, in comic books. But the Flintstones is art because it not only spoke to its time, but it's of our time. This is a brand new strip from Bill Griffith, the creator of Zippy the Pinhead. So that's what we're going to find out tonight. It's about time. It's about what made the Flintstones tick. And for that, we're going to have to go back in time because the story of the Flintstones, one of the great American television shows, begins with the story of the movies. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, one of the great movie giants of the golden age of movies. Well, they also made cartoons. And the most famous cartoon was the Tom and Jerry cartoon. And it was the ultimate cat and mouse. This is what Itchy and Scratchy are basically based on. That's why there's really no dialogue. Unlike the Warner Brothers cat and mouse cartoons, which had dialogue, this one didn't. But Tom and Jerry in the 40s were so famous and successful that this won an Academy Award, Anchors Away in 1948. The famous sequence, young person, if you've never seen this, Dad, you must show this to him. Dad, have you seen it? Okay, security, yeah, these two, right there. Okay, but who created the Tom and Jerry cartoons? The team of William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, shown here with their producer, the great Fred Quimby, mugging at each other. One guy was a little more creative, the other guy was a little more business, but they were both business and they were both creative. And you can see them as the young Hanna-Barbera acting out like every other picture you've seen of every other animator in this Hanna-Barbera show. You all have to act it out. But what happened in the 1950s? Television killed the movies. Video killed the radio star, television killed the movies. So along with the movie business in general going through shifts, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer shut down its cartoon division by the mid-50s, leaving Hanna and Barbera adrift. Eventually, they were able to form their own studio with a partnership of Screen Gems, which is going to come in handy a little bit later. They're going to be very important in terms of how the Flintstones ended up on the air. But they decided to be groundbreaking and create economical television cartoons for television, not for the movies, which didn't have the movie budget. And they started in 1957 with the Ruffin Radio Show. Now, these were shown at the daytime, so they were still cartoons for kids, but they were new cartoons shown on television. And immediately, Rough and Ready, which you can see being a cat and mouse cartoon, or a dog and a what is well, you know what I'm trying to say. It's like a cat and a mouse. But my point is that very successful right off the bat. So their next creation, you can see the sketch back there of Huckleberry Hound. Oh, so merry Huckleberry, Huckleberry Hound. Somebody wanted to do a karaoke. Who wanted to do Hanna-Barbera karaoke? We'll have that later. Quick Draw McGraw, and of course the sidekick, Baba Louie, which Howard Stern's sidekick mispronounced as Baba Booey, and that is why you've got the name Baba Booey now, is an American institution. And their third great cartoon creation for daytime television, which was very successful, was Yogi Bear. And it was after this in 1960, being so successful, that their partner at Screen Gems, remember I told you Screen Gems, suggested to Hanna-Barbera, you're successful at daytime, why don't you try a nighttime cartoon? And in 1959 or so, that was obviously radical. By the way, when you look at the old Flintstones ending, you'll be able to see the Screen Gems logo. So Hanna-Barbera turned to the designer that made the designs of those 3 cartoons successful. This guy. He did Yogi Bear. He did Quick Draw McGraw. He did Huckleberry Hound. Ed Benedict basically created every Hanna-Barbera icon you could think of. Not only did he, of course, design the preliminary images of the Flintstones, not exactly these. You're going to see earlier versions than this. But of course, he created the Jetsons and basically every Scooby-Doo, every major Hanna-Barbera cartoon up until I think 1974. Here's a picture of him, I think in the early 70s, and he passed away, I think in 2006 or something, 90 years old. But he's one of the giants of the animation field. And here he is on the left as a young man in the 1930s. To the right is the famous Tex Avery, the animator that gave us the ultimate bug-eyed cartoons for MGM in the 1940s and 50s. Anyway, Ed Benedict got to work for him in the 50s, and one of the cartoons that Ed Benedict designed, which is not credited to him, is called The First Bad Man. It's credited to Tex Avery, but it's all about Stone Age life in Texas, in the Stone Age. So if you look at these designs, which again are probably done by Ed Benedict, but Tex Avery got the credit, you can see the little men back there have clubs, and this is what they look like. So they've got the Western hats. Now you got to remember, in 1955, every other TV show, and I'm not exaggerating, was a Western. In fact, I think more than every other TV show. I think 9 out of 10 shows were Westerns. So it's not surprising that they decided to do a cartoon, but it's Texas, so that's why the buildings have a very Southwest kind of, the adobe kind of buildings. Of course, why are they dressed alike? Because they buy all their clothes from the same. And obviously, you can see the Flintstones allusions immediately. Here is their idea. Again, there's the Southwest idea of the Stone Age. But this idea of taking the Stone Age and bringing it up to date was not a new idea. If you go back to 1934 and the comic strip Alley Oop by V.T. Hamlin, that I think is still running by one of his descendants or somebody, but Alley Oop, as you can see by the Sunday example from the 1930s or 40s, is basically the Flintstones. It's cavemen talking in modern parlance. Now, if you look at comic books themselves, in the 40s, I happened to stumble upon this Action Comics cover, but there's Lois Lane dressed up as, she could be Betty Rubble and doing the Stone Age news. But the biggest influence on the Flintstones, and it had to be, is the comic strip BC, which is never really mentioned when people discuss the Flintstones. They always talk about the Honeymooners, which we will get into. But BC was created in 1958 by Johnny Hart. And there is its cast of characters. And in fact, Hart describes BC, shown here, the main character, as, he goes, BC, are you for real? What are you, the caveman's thinking man's caveman? A Neanderthal nebbish? Bone Age beatnik, or what? And Hart described BC as a humble, meek, kind, naive Slav, a.k.a. Barney Rubble, basically. And Fred, shown here in these original sketches by Ann Benedict, is essentially a composite of the other main BC characters. One is Thor, and Thor is, this is Peter, called a self-styled genius, the world's first philosophical failure. As you know from watching Flintstones, Fred had plenty of philosophical failures, among other failures. Curls was a master of sarcastic wit, and then Thor was an inventor, artist, ladies' man, the inventor of the wheel and the comb. And when you look at some early BC stuff and the way they were drawn back then, you can see how Fred and Barney picked up right from where BC left off. In fact, the inventions of Thor, you can see in the Flintstones' very first episode, it wasn't the first one made, it was the first one that aired, and, there it is, the crazy inventions. In addition, Peter was a golfer, and there were many golfing episodes with both Fred and Barney taking a try at the tee. Then, of course, there were the BC women, which you can easily see as models for Wilma and Betty. These are Ed Benedict's. I'm sorry, I went a little too fast there. I wanted to show you a little bit closer. But you can see, and even these evolved over time. You'll see some earlier ones. This is one of Ed Benedict's very first sketches for what were probably Wilma and Betty. Now you can see from the cartoon he did in '55 that this attitude where she whips out the thing and, slams them, that's totally Tex Avery, with the bugging things. But you can see in this attitude, the Flintstones would turn the tables on Fred many times. But there is Ed Benedict's very first sketch for Fred and Barney. And you can see in some of these early storyboards, already they had the phone gizmo worked out, which we'll see in a little while. But look down there, and you'll see one of the very first sketches of Fred and what he looked like with Ed Benedict's notes. There's the front view, and we've got the profile view. And obviously you can see how just from your sense memory of the Flintstones, just his hair alone and how it went through many changes. But this is the image that I showed to begin my presentation. And you're wondering, who is this character over here? That ain't Pebbles. No, that was Fred Jr. They originally wanted to give the Flintstones a son. And if you look at some of the original merchandising from 1960, 61, there are still elements of Fred Jr. there. But it wasn't called the Flintstones. The first name of this proposal that Hanna-Barbera pitched was the Gladstones. And it turns out they couldn't use the name the Gladstones for some copyright reasons. So this, what I'm about to show you, is what would be called the little proposal film, almost test footage, that Hanna-Barbera made probably around 1959 to show the network to see if they were going to buy it. Here we are.
Wilma, when are we going shopping?
As soon as I serve His Majesty's lunch.
Louder.
He's dining at the pool today. Where's Barney?
Oh, he's trying on his gear.
Gear?
That's right. He's going to practice spear fishing in the pool.
Spear fishing?
Wilma!
Oh, I'll be right back. I've got to feed the fish. Where do you want it, Fred?
Just set it down where I can reach it.
And remember, if you sink, don't let my best dishes go down with the ship. Barney, it's you.
There we go.
Did my spearfishing outfit scare you?
Out of my wits. And don't scare Fred, or he'll lose his lunch and my dishes.
Hiya, Fred.
And what are you made up for?
I'm gonna practice spearfishing.
Oh, you can't lose. You'll either spare them or they'll die laughing. How does it work? And don't point that thing at me. It's loaded.
Oops.
Barney boy, you're making it tough to be friends.
No use wasting the lunch.
So that's what ABC executives saw, and this is how they responded. I don't know if you could read this that well, but this is a memo. Notice the name, it became the Flagstones, but I'll tell you why the Flagstones didn't work. But notice what they say here. They go, screened opening show. This failed both in story content and in its promise of prehistoric elements. It seemed like a takeoff on the Honeymooners, Gleason Carney. Now remember I told you first the Flagstones. The reason why that name didn't take is that High and Lois, the comic strip by Mort Walker and Dick Brand, had just started in the late 50s, and their last name was the Flagstones, S-T-O-N. So they felt that they couldn't use it. But in terms of the Honeymooners thing, I mean, are you kidding me? This very first gag is basically taken from the famous Man from Space episode where Norton shows up dressed as his sewer guy, and they mistake him for a man from space. That was the gag that Wilma, I don't know if you could hear without the volume, but of course the Honeymooners were what they based the Flintstones on. I mean, not only in the breakup of the male-female duo, but of course, you know, in the way they got along, the way they teamed up against each other. of course, the image that you're used to seeing. Fred never came close to pointing a fist at Wilma like Ralph did, but it was the same basic relationship. Some of the episodes, the plots were the same. They get stuck together, and of course, there was the Flintstones episode, but I think every sitcom, the duo gets stuck together somehow. You know, it's like not only the Flintstones. Every duo, male duo, somehow found an episode where they could sleep together, just like the Flintstones. Don't even ask me what this image is about, but we'll talk about that later. Definitely the water buffaloes, loyal order of, what were they called, the raccoons? That became the loyal order of water buffaloes. The way Ralph would treat Norton was pretty much, obviously, the way Fred would belittle and physically intimidate. I mean, Ralph, again, okay, thank God he didn't punch, you know, Alice, but he would definitely lay a hand on Norton. And I mean, there was some intense violence on the Flintstones, especially when you have the freeze frame and you can stop it on images like that. But also, remember, they loved to watch TV whenever Norton would have it. And the Flintstones was really the first TV show about TV, as we're going to get into a lot later. A lot of people don't realize just as much as the Honeymooners was, of course, I Love Lucy, with the same male-female breakup, the same plots, of course. There's always a reason to get men in women's clothing, and, you know, they did it with Fred, too. But I think the male-female relationship between Lucy and Ethel was a little closer to Wilma and Betty, especially because of the phone. You got to remember, Alice didn't have a phone. Only the wealthy Nortons had a phone. But, you know, in the more middle-class I Love Lucy, everybody had a phone, so Ethel was on the phone just like Betty was on the phone with Wilma, you know, every other episode. The celebrity worship that I Love Lucy had, you can see echoed in so many Flintstones episodes, which we'll get into later. And just like every other 50s couple, they slept apart, so too did the Flintstones sleep apart. I had a crack team of researchers finding these esoteric images just to prove to you that yes, even in the Stone Age, they slept apart. And just like Ricky and Desi sold cigarettes, so too, if you remember from my opening intro, did Fred and Wilma. Here we go. Winston's 1960.
They sure work hard, don't they, Barney?
Yeah? I hate to see them work so hard.
Yeah, me too. Let's go around back where we can't see them.
Gee, we ought to do something, Fred.
Okay? How's about taking a nap?
Hey, I got a better idea. Let's take a Winston break.
That's it! Winston is the one filter cigarette that delivers flavor 20 times a pack. Winston's got that filter blend.
Yeah, Fred. Filter blend makes the big taste difference, and only Winston has it up front where it counts. Here, ahead of the pure white filter. Winston packs rich tobaccos
And the volume.
and specially processed for good flavor in filter smoking.
Yeah, Barney, Winston tastes good, like a cigarette should.
First of all, if you notice, that commercial was like a minute and a half long. You know, we're used to 30-second commercials. But in those days, commercials were a minute. They would belabor the selling point over and over again. I love it when Barney whips out this giant Winstones pack. But you could see, even then, early Barney, you could see, kept with those same very squat character designs of Ed Benedict's first design, just like you can see how this early design of Fred eventually morphed into this later design. You can see in these Ed Benedict character model sheets how the name the Gladstones was crossed out. He was going to be Fred. You would think Fred Flintstone, just the alliterative nature, would have been a natural. So this was another kind of happy accident that resulted in the name that you can't imagine it not being. Now, Ed Benedict had help at Hanna-Barbera, of course, in people doing the animation and the layouts and the drawings. The one that is most well known is Dick Bickenbach, and these are his storyboards. And you can just see in these little sketches, you can imagine in your mind's eye the way the Flintstones look. From these little sketches, more detailed drawings would be made. When you look at the credits of the Flintstones, these are the names you see at the end. And there's a major Asian influence. You know, we talk about now with anime and the biggest Asian influence. Well, Iwo Takamoto is one of the most famous Hanna-Barbera designers, kind of like Ed Benedict. He designed and worked on every Hanna-Barbera creation you could think of, but he did so much work on the Flintstones. So if you think about it, the Asian anime influence was there early on in what you would think is American television animation. Here's another character sketch, and you could see the various Flintstone characters coming to form. Look how Wilma goes through a bit of a change. Here she is on the Gladstones pilot, and then here's how she looks on the actual episode that was made from that, which was called The Swimming Pool, which was the third episode to run. Look at early Betty. Now, the voice on the cartoon, I don't know if you could hear with our volume problems, but that was the voice of the great June Foray. June Foray was the voice of Rocky and Bullwinkle, which, by the way, it was because of the success of the Flintstones that Rocky and Bullwinkle in 1961 were moved to prime time. The other great voice that June Foray is known for, in addition to a million other voices, she was Talkie Tina, I'm Going to Kill You, on The Twilight Zone. So there's Betty Rubble, there's the model sheet. Again, you could see it crossed out, early Dino, and then you can see how the model sheets were then developed, the next step into color, and then how it wound up looking like on television. So the Hanna-Barbera crew took their notes from ABC, they did their work, they revised it, they got to work, and here's the fall preview issue of TV Guide that came out the very week in late September that the Flintstones debuted. So there's the write-up. Now, remember I told you every other TV show was a Western? There it is, competing with the Flintstones, a Western. So, and that's, by the way, look at the type from the previous column, a cross-border saloon. That means there were two Westerns in the same time slot as the Flintstones. And what's really odd is that here's the ad that ABC ran using the early version of the Gladstones. But here is the very first show opening in 1960 that aired on September 30th, 8:30 at nighttime on a Friday night. The first thing you notice about this opening is, where is the Meet the Flintstones opening you're used to? This was the opening that Hanna-Barbera created for the 1960 season, the 1961 season, and for half of the 62 season. Midway through 62, they came up with the Meet the Flintstones theme song, which we'll talk about a little later. But this was the very first opening. The song is called Rise and Shine. And if you get the Flintstones CD that they put out, it's one of the songs on there. Look at early Fred. You can still see the Ed Benedict design. Later on, you can see Fred got a little shorter and a little squatter. But what we can decipher from this opening is so much about America in 1960, or at least America in LA and Hollywood and the West Coast. Because I like how Fred drives under the underpass. I mean, this was the highway system, thanks to Robert Moses, all across the country, connecting America like the rail did a century before. But this was so much a part of the suburban sprawl of the post-war era in American history, and the Flintstones dealt with it, and it was all about basically Los Angeles in the early 60s. And, you know, shopping centers, all of the elements of suburbia and kind of urban sprawl are in the Flintstones. Of course, we see the name of the town, Bedrock. How they decided on population 2,500, I don't know. Maybe somebody that knows their California history might know of a town that they might have picked that's 2,500. But here is our panorama view of Bedrock, and you can see that it was trying to be a Stone Age Levittown, basically, but again, that was a big motif of America in the post-war. And it was the classic suburban ranch house that the Flintstones animators tried to translate in Stone Age form. And this is kind of what they came up with, and it's an image and a look that we know of right away. And that's the kind of suburban Stone Age hut, or whatever you want to call that house, that Fred lived in. He kisses Wilma here. She's introduced in the opening. This introduces also the idea that, like Ralph Cramden, Fred is a big eater, and he would make his Dagwood sandwiches, which is, of course, taken from Dagwood, the comic strip. But the thing I like most about this opening is that it establishes the idea that the Flintstones was a show about television itself. It's the beginning of the couch gag. That's where the Simpsons got the couch gag. When you see Family Guy watching TV together, it all comes from the idea of the Flintstones watching television and what was on. And we, along with the Flintstones, were watching them watch television. And America was doing this in the 50s. And not just kids were watching the Flintstones even though it was on at night, but of course the whole family back then watched television. And in the early 60s, color starts to come in. Specifically, NBC branded itself with color. Although the logo was always presented in black and white, the CBS logo. These were the network giants that didn't want to have anything to do with the Flintstones. Who did they pitch it to? ABC. In 1960, ABC was like the Fox network of the day. You know, they would try anything because they were the third place. They were like not even Avis. They tried the hardest to succeed. But if you look at the history of the 1960s, ABC had the single greatest color television show ever. I mean, Batman was created for color TV, and that's why ABC changed their logo in the early 60s to the full color. But that's also why ABC was the only network daring enough to take a chance on a nighttime animated sitcom. And that, to me, is a key to why we love the Flintstones. I remember even as a child, there was something romantic, and I use the term romantic in its artistic sense, about watching a cartoon at night. We were used to watching cartoons in the daytime. But all of these scenes, I remember as a kid, held a particular fascination. You know, Bruce Springsteen's written about 20 songs with the word night in them. You know, there's something about history is made at night, somebody said. There's something about the Flintstones at night, and that there were scenes. Now, there were plenty of scenes in the daytime, but the scenes that I always gravitated towards, the stories, were about, you're laughing. I love that you're laughing. You right there. You're great. Anyway, but yes, some of the scenes were at night, and then some of them were the day. And this was the Flintstones ranch home that you're used to seeing, but it's not the one that we see in the very first episode. This almost looks like a space pod, but that's how we're introduced to Fred Flintstone in the very first episode. And we find out later in the show that he lives on Cobblestone Lane, kind of like the Simpsons. We're still trying to find out where Springfield is. But he's waiting for his morning paper, which the character who later becomes Arnold, you know, gives to Fred, but of course he gives it to him in a way he doesn't expect it. And this image is a good segue into the scathing reviews that hit the Flintstones and Hanna-Barbera as hard as that stone tablet. If you look at Gilbert Seldes, Gilbert Seldes is a famous cultural critic. And you got to read his review that was in the New York Times. And he begins by saying this. I love it. Wait, sorry, my notes are a little screwed up. Pardon me. We can edit this out later, right? For the HBO special. Where's my notes? Oh, here we go. Starting a few feet above low water mark, the Flintstones has moved steadily in one direction, downward. And here's how he concludes. I never felt that I had to defend each program offered, but the Flintstones is going to make life hard for me. I cannot fall back on the consolation that such programs do no harm. They do harm. They put over the second and third best on people who want the best. So long as the Flintstones exist, some people will turn them on. It's better than nothing, but only the least bit better. And it's ironic because TV Guide had a bit of a love-hate relationship in the Flintstones Because you can see, this is in July of 1961, a couple months after that horrible review printed. But the Flintstones was a rating success overnight, and it was even a bigger success in merchandising. Right from the beginning, the Flintstones was a merchandising juggernaut. Even these famous Viewmaster films, look, they based this one on the Flintstones flyer, the very first episode. And anybody fondly remembers, this is the first time we saw the Flintstones as three-dimensional characters. But right from the get-go, these are all going on eBay, for thousands of dollars now. They're collector's items. But, three-dimensional Flintstones figures. And if you look at this promotional image of Hanna-Barbera with a kind of a three-dimensional Flintstone there, yeah, the advertising revenue that they got, not only from Winston, but other advertisers. Look at these. For some reason, only black and white footage of some of these commercials remains. But I love the juxtaposition of the photographic can with, the Flintstones animation. I think that's a great look. But they knew that Fred Flintstone was a cash cow, so to speak. So let's take a close-up look at Fred Flintstone and what he was about. Look at the early Ed Benedict design. It's a little more rubbery, a little more expressive. As the years went on, Fred became, like a lot of cartoons, they become kind of solidified in one basic look. But Flintstones aficionados tend to like the earlier Flintstones because the faces were much more expressive and literally more cartoony. And the emotions that Fred would express, this was Jackie Gleason animated. He was a human cartoon character. So when you see these images, you can imagine, Fred as live action, you can imagine Ralph Kramden animated. But obviously in cartoons, you can take the exaggeration even one step further. But what made Fred tick, like all the Flintstones characters, is the range of expressions. They weren't just one joke. So Fred could cry. Fred could feel real expressions like guilt. Okay, they had to layer it on heavy-handed, but, this image is on screen for like 2 seconds, but I've always loved this image, and yeah, it reminds me of Magritte. But I'm not the only one that thinks it reminds me of Magritte, because in the 1980s, a cartoonist named John Kelly produced this piece in which he bases famous art pieces and kind of does a mashup with the Flintstones. And this is something that starts to happen in the 1980s and 90s, that various pop culture artists and illustrators begin to take Flintstones imagery. Now, this is Frank Kozik. He's a great poster. Rolling Stone had a whole story about him a couple of years ago. And there is his Barney. Now, you can see that this is a kind of an updated version of that very first, very squat Barney. And his face, and in particular his eyes, went through a lot of transformation. Barney looks like a real schlemiel when he starts, if I might drop that Yiddishism. And look at his eyes, how they change. They're very dark, round circles. I kind of like this version of Barney, kind of squatter and a little thicker. But yeah, what's happening with the eyes? Finally, in the 1965 season, the sixth and last season, they resolved that Barney would have solid black eyes, but it took him 5 years to get to that point. You can see in this earlier image, he's still got the kind of vacant white eyes. But what do we love about Barney? Barney had a lot of interests. As a comic fan, I love the fact that he's reading the comics. But Barney was kind of a hep cat. He was a musician. In the very first episode, he's banging on the drums. All of a sudden, he's a real drummer. When they're singing Happy Anniversary, there's Barney on the keyboards. Look at this hep cat, right? And then he's got Betty, hello. This is where the Fabulous Baker Boys got the idea from. Come on, right? That's what I always thought. And then Fred, of course, had to join in too. The two of them were real musicians. Who can forget Fred singing When the Saints Go Marching In, right? But that wasn't Fred singing. That was a Hanna-Barbera guy that had been around, this guy named Duke Mitchell. He was an actor. He ended up doing these weird films in the 70s. He's got a whole story, but he was the singing voice behind Fred's, he sang When the Saints Go Marching In, and this other song, Listen to the Mockingbird, in which, of course, Hanna-Barbera came up with two motions that they would recycle throughout the whole song. right? That's the way they did it. Another musical persona that Fred adopted was that of Rockroll. Now, of all the Flintstones rock and stone names, you're never going to get better than Rockroll. Am I right, people? And of course, he's 6, so in the classic sitcom plot 39B, Fred has to dress up as Rockroll and take his place. And how is he introduced? He's introduced by not Ed Sullivan, but Ed Sullystone, one of the many celebrity impersonations. So here is The Twitch by Rockroll. Volume?
And his hit record, The Twitch.
There's a town I know where the hipsters go called Bedrock. Twitch, twitch, when you get an itch, then you do the twitch in Bedrock. Twitch, twitch, cause the twitching's fine, have yourself a time in Bedrock. Twitch, twitch.
Fred, I want to know now.
Well, we'll twist around the clock tonight in Bedrock. Twitch, twitch, and Rock is gonna roll with all his might in Bedrock. Twitch, twitch, it's a swinging town, so I'll see you down in Bedrock. Twitch, twitch, yeah, yeah.
Fred, who did you get?
Him. That's so I got Rockroll to come perform at your show. Now will you get off my back?
Fred, what did you say?
Yeah, what did I say?
Oh, Fred, say it again.
I got Rockroll to perform at your show. Oh, boy.
The voice of Rockroll was, again, not Alan Reed, the voice of Fred Flintstone. It was character actor and Hanna-Barbera voice actor on, again, A Million Voices, a guy named Hal Smith. He might look familiar because you've seen him on the Andy Griffith Show. He's in lockup here. But he had that kind of hillbilly voice that you've heard on 1001 cartoons. Here's another rock and roll persona that Fred adopts. And what I like about this character, I mean, come on. Is that not Elvis Costello ahead of his time? But I love how in this episode, speaking of Elvis, they actually take the Colonel Parker-Elvis relationship and they play it out with the Colonel Parker Flintstones version over there. Now, the Flintstones never quite did the Beatles, even though they overlap at the same time. This is maybe the closest they got. Maybe the closest they got was the Beau Brummel Stones in a 1965-66 episode. The Beau Brummels were one of the many British invasion bands that had their one hit and came and went. And then in the last season, you know, the Flintstones had a lot of music, the Way Outs, they were called. But, you know, there was nothing more way out than the Flintstones themselves being musicians and able to play. And it's out of this idea that you get everything from the Archies to the Partridge Family. The idea of a family playing music together comes once again out of the Flintstones. Now, all music was fair game. Look, they even did Liberace one night on the Flintstones. But maybe their most famous to Flintstones aficionados musical episode was when they took the great Hoagie Carmichael and they animated him. And here's what he looked like in real life, so you can see how close the Hanna-Barbera, sketch was to him. But, a lot of people thought he was a very handsome man. I mean, look at this photograph of Hoagie Carmichael in his heyday. This is the image that the creator of James Bond, Ian Fleming, was his first choice to play Bond, believe it or not. Remember, Bond was a gentleman's spy. If he couldn't get David Niven, he said, I'll take Hoagie Carmichael. And when you see an image like this, and you look at what Sean Connery ended up doing, you can see how Ian Fleming was maybe on the money about it. But maybe my single favorite Flintstones episode is the spoof on James Bond, the 1964 season J. Bondrock with his judo chop chop. Because I love James Bond and Sean Connery so much, this is my single favorite episode. And instead of Dr. No, they had Madam Yes. Remember, the only good pun is a bad pun. So, it had to be Madam Yes. But my single favorite Flintstone gag, which I couldn't find a video clip from, is their running gag throughout the episode, I hope you might remember this, is they were only going out to get Bronto burgers, and then they get judo chop chop, and then as Fred falls, Barney goes, and some buns. Does anybody remember that gag? Bronto burgers and buns. I'm bleeding up here for you people. No, but my point is that's my single favorite gag. By the way, that episode came out 2 months before Goldfinger comes out. So the Flintstones actually was more influenced by From Russia with Love and Dr. No. But another big movie that influenced the Flintstones in one of their most memorable episodes was the 1963 It Girl, Ann-Margrock, of course. Look, this is the January 11th, 63 issue where she's on the cover. And they decided to animate her. Her agent knew Hanna-Barbera's agent. It was one of those deals where they wanted to promote her, and Hanna-Barbera signed up. Look at the model sheet that they made of her and what ended up coming out. And there is she on the episode, and I think she's got a quote here where she talks about how people always asked her the rest of her career, how come you never did another Flintstones episode? Because, I mean, look at how ABC, it was the lead-off episode of the 1963 season, and they took out print ads. But this is what she said when asked about why she didn't reprise her role as Ann-Margrock. She goes, you know, the Flintstones producers begged me to reprise the role of Ann-Margrock, but I couldn't because of my schedule. I was disappointed. I loved everything about her. Every Halloween, I open the door, and the kids look astonished and say, lady, are you Ann-Margrock? And maybe the other big movie star that the Flintstones landed was when they got Stony Curtis. And I think that's a pretty good likeness. Here he is in the studio recording his part. That's a little bit of Dale Messick, one of the great Hanna-Barbera voice artists. And here's Stony Curtis on screen. Now, the running gag throughout the Flintstones was the real star, the guy that wanted to be a star, was Fred Flintstone himself. And in one of my other favorite episodes, The Frogmouth, I think it's called Holly Rock, Here We Come or something, but to make a half-hour episode short, Wilma gets accidentally cast in a television production in Holly Rock called The Frogmouth. And the Frogmouth is supposed to be this big lug who's supposed to say, after Wilma recites her famous line, does anybody remember? Bill, the baby's college fund is missing. Did you take it? Boy, tough crowd. You know what I mean by tough crowd? It's a tough crowd. But he's supposed to react like, what do you mean the college fund is missing? How dare you accuse, the Frogmouth. Anyway, after Wilma delivers the line, the Frogmouth basically has a little tiny, oh yeah, so what? So what do you want to do about it? Anyway, it drives the director nuts that they're about to go on air live and they don't have a Frogmouth. Well, Fred is in the background seeing Wilma up on stage. How dare she be on stage without, asking his permission? I don't know what the big macho thing was. But the point is he's outraged that Wilma's up on stage, so he starts screaming. Well, the director, of course, has now found the perfect Frogmouth. Well, now Mr. Ego is going to be a big star. So in the typical Ed Benedict earlier version of Fred, that goes wild. But as we all know, just like Ralph Cramden, when he finally gets on TV, of course, he cracks. And this is as good a place as any to show you the opening you're familiar with.
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. They're the modern Stony family. From the town of Bedrock, they're a page right out of history. Let's ride with the family down the street through the courtesy of Fred and Pete. When you're with the Flintstones, have a yabba-dabba-doo time. A dabba-doo time. We'll have a gay old time.
I think along with the theme of the Twilight Zone and the Batman theme by Neil Hefti, I think the Flintstones theme is the third of the trio of great television themes of all time. And it's funny, for some reason, I could only find the credit of Hoyt Curtin on the earlier opening. For some reason, on the later openings, maybe I missed it, I didn't see Hoyt Curtin being given credit. But Hoyt Curtin, there on the left, conducting the Hanna-Barbera Orchestra, basically, just like Ed Benedict and all these other guys, he created every Hanna-Barbera great theme you can think of, from Top Cat to the Jetsons to you name it. Now, he wasn't conducting a prehistoric orchestra. But that was a running theme throughout the Flintstones, that there was a sort of jazzy, hepcat undercurrent to the music. But here is what it actually looked like conducting. Now, for some reason, the only picture I could find, that's not Hoyt Curtin conducting. But basically, he created all the great music you hear in the Flintstones. Basically, as the story goes, Hanna-Barbera wanted to create a Flintstones theme song, so they wrote lyrics. But for the music, they went back to the very first episode, the swimming pool. And in that episode, there's a little instrumental theme in the background. And it's da-na, da-na-na-na. It's basically the music that became Meet the Flintstones, with the lyrics probably by Hanna-Barbera. Now, in those end credits, you see written by Warren Foster. That's the gentleman on the right. He was the main writer for the Flintstones. And you could see that the cartoon show we know and love was basically created by a bunch of older white men. As today's political correctness would brand, oh, all the white Europeans have dominated our culture. Well, guess what? In American pop culture, it was a bunch of older white men that created this bedrock of pop culture that we know of as the Flintstones. And they had some of the best people working for them. Now, that is Michael Maltese on the left. He was the writer of all those great Warner Brothers cartoons that you know and love, that were voiced by Mel Blanc, who voiced Barney Rubble, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But one of the things I love about that ending is the scene at the drive-in, which after I saw American Graffiti in 1973, again, always gave me this romantic idea of California at night. And that was another appeal of the Flintstones. The drive-in movie, the scene at night, again. And it's very interesting. I was able to find this image of the drive-in from about the time period of the Flintstones. And it's really ironic that the Flintstones would pay homage to the drive-in movie, which by 1960 was on its way out, because everybody was basically home watching television. So it's really a bit of an irony that the Great Flintstones ending has the movie theater in it, when really, once again, the show was all about characters watching television. And the shows that they were watching were basically knockoffs of all the characters they were used to seeing on TV. Like, of course, the great Alfred Hitchcock was one of the first celebrities. This is Bill Cullen of The Prize is Priced, as the Flintstones would call it. Then, of course, you had Ben Casement, I think, was the Ben Casey knockoff, right? And then one of my, again, favorites was the Sassy episode, where Dino falls in love with a cartoon dog, which is, of course, a spoof of Lassie. What I love about Sassy is that the minute the camera yells cut, all the stars hate each other. But, the minute the camera is on, they all love each other. So that's a great little thing. One of the last spoofs was The Munsters, which was an ABC show. And this was beginning to be a part of the Flintstones that began to kind of rerun itself, was whatever ABC wanted to promote, there would be a Flintstones version of it. So Bewitched, airing on ABC in 1965, got its Bewitched episode. Now, if the animation looks familiar, it's because Hanna-Barbera was hired by ABC to design the animation of the classic Bewitched opening. But if you look at the humanity and the warmth that Hanna-Barbera's designers were able to get into their drawings, that begins to get to the heart of what we love about the Flintstones, is that kind of like Charles Schulz, whose museum is, I think, near here, what they were able to do with a few lines, like if you look at the lines on Wilma's eyes, half closed, look at the expression on Fred's face, those expressions speak volumes. And any young artists out there, or older artists, know what I'm talking about. The ability to portray human emotion in a very few number of lines is really amazing. So whether it was kind of contentment like this, or real anger, or sometimes Fred would be literally jumping for joy, but usually the feet weren't in the air, they were in his mouth because of something he would say, a la Ralph Cramden, which would wind him up on his knees, always begging for forgiveness. But this might be my single favorite, tenderest moment, and I wish my computer was set up where I could have taken a little screen, like a little bit of animation, but I couldn't quite figure out how to do it on my system. But this features that earlier version of Fred by whichever animator this is, which gave it a little bit more expression. But I just love the tenderness with which Wilma tickled his ear and gave him that kiss, and that became a recurring motif. Not so much Fred kissing Wilma, because in the Flintstones, it was more like Wilma always kissing Fred. Now, in the Honeymooners, it was always this scene. You never got to see the actual kiss. They probably weren't actually kissing, but that's what you saw. Now, Barney and Betty were another story. Here's an image that we got, and then their relationship seemed a lot more loving and a lot more tender in images like this than Fred and Wilma seemed to have. And for those of us that love Betty, there's something about Betty that's a little bit warmer, a little bit even sexier. I mean, Wilma tried a little too hard sometimes, but all Betty had to do was bat those eyelashes, and there was something that, I speak for only myself, but I'm sure I'm speaking for many men here, you know, we fell for Betty, which is why now you see out in the culture, Betty's become a real pop icon. I mean, these are things I just find on the internet, and I keep a file on my desktop, Flintstones images. You know, this is based on the famous 50-foot woman. But, you know, I don't even know what some of these things are for. You know, before there was Bedrock, there was Rubble. You know, these are all made, you know, these are the things you find on the internet. But there's that cartoonist John Kelly. Again, this is from the early or mid-'80s, or maybe the early '90s. But without going into detail, you can see it's treating Betty as this like visual icon and kind of deconstructing Betty. But like when Betty did a commercial, it was for soft soap. When Wilma did a commercial, it was for meat. It was for rock and spiel. Now, who can sing along with me? Keep your hubby happy, happy hubby. Who remembers the rock and spiel song? When he's a little chubby, he's a happy pappy. With rock and spiel? Oh boy, I'm dying up here. I'm dying up here. Nobody remembers the rock and spiel jingle? Wasn't that a prerequisite to buying your ticket? You had to, no? Okay, so the thing about Wilma is that she could not only bag the dinosaur, but she could cook it and she could bring it home to Fred. But sometimes she was overbearing. She'd make Fred feel literally 6 inches tall. Betty, on the other hand, was a different kind of wife. Yeah, I know, bizarre image. I can't explain these images. Don't shoot the messenger. I just find them. But for some people, Wilma was the perfect wife. For others, it's Betty. But yet Betty remains an enigma, wrapped inside a cannoli, tucked inside an eggplant. Or something. I don't know. But yeah, what is it about the difference between Betty and Wilma? Why is it that when they took a poll, this is many years ago, that men, 10 to 1, would rather sleep with, who do you think, Betty or Wilma? Now, this is an image I find off the internet. This begins to show a little bit of what we're talking about. But it's really no different than the pop culture contest between Ginger and Marianne. Why is it that men chose 10 to 1 Betty over Wilma? Now, they're like one of the great female pop culture duos. You've got Betty and Veronica from the Archie comics. You've got Lois and Lana. They were friends, but they were always plotting. You see, their relationship was kind of this. Very different from Wilma and Betty's relationship, which was much more tender, not so jealous, not so much infighting. But it all changed when Wilma got pregnant. That's when the Flintstones jumped the shark. Why? Let me show you what happened. Okay, so Pebbles gets born. She's cute, right? Immediately, she's the talk of the town. She's in the TV Guide. The last time the TV Guide covered a television birth, you'd have to go back to the early 50s when Lucy's Desi was born and TV Guide covered it. But here is the 1963 feature in TV Guide all about Pebbles Flintstone. And when they asked Hanna-Barbera about why Pebbles Flintstone, they said, well, remember Fred Jr.? They wanted a boy, but they were told by their toy licensees that a girl child would sell much more things, much more products, much more merchandise. So that's why they decided on a girl. So the first thing they did was put Pebbles in the graphic opening. But if you look at the openings from 1963 and on, there's a quick shot to building boulders while they're, Fred's gathering them up to take them to the drive-in movie. And Hanna-Barbera manufactured not only Pebbles dolls, but they manufactured building boulders and sold them. So you talk about product placement, the Flintstones was ahead of its time in many things. But Pebbles' birth gave a boost to all of the merchandising, and it became such a part of the show to the point where ABC actually did an on-air promo for the Flintstones with Fred as a, home dad. Now again, Flintstones were ahead of its time. Now they talk about men spending time at home and raising the kids. Well, here it was on the Flintstones. And unfortunately, for those of us that love the Flintstones, too many episodes were centered around Pebbles and all of that, to the point where an image like this, to me, talks about what kind of happened to Fred's personality, is that he lost it once he became a father. I love this scene that was on air for about 2 seconds. Look at the expressions on Betty and Barney of having to see their new child being paraded in front of them. And how did that make Betty and Barney feel? It made them feel like this, which takes away from the beautiful interior decoration of the Stone Age. I mean, I really like this image because, but yeah, I mean, poor Betty is crying, and this is another one of the Flintstones' most tenderest moments in animation history, is when Barney, with his vacant eyes, but with the slight lines that give him that little sadness, wiping away Betty's tears at not being able to give birth. Now this is, again, it's a cartoon at night, but it's watched by a lot of kids. This is still a heavy-duty episode. And what do? They wish upon a star for a child. And the next morning, as the sun rises on beautiful downtown Bedrock, lo and behold, what appears on Barney and Betty's doorstep but Bam Bam. Now, when we look at Bam Bam, if you know your rough and ready Hanna-Barbera history, they had a little caveman boy character called Ubble Double. And Ubble Double becomes Barney Rubble. I mean, Bam Bam Rubble. And that's how you get Bam Bam. And in the first episode, because Bam Bam, they have to legally adopt him, Barney has to give Bam Bam up. And this is another tender moment in the history of why we love the Flintstones. Because how many cartoons come and go where you never feel one iota of emotion throughout the whole run of those cartoons that you might feel at this very moment? And I mean, talk about ahead of its time. You had a cartoon episode about them going to the Child Welfare Authority. And Barney and Betty have to get a lawyer and basically sue to keep Bam Bam, or they have to basically present their case before the judge. But their lawyer is already going to give up the case. Why? Because Perry Masonry steps in as the lawyer for the opposing family that wants to keep Bam Bam. Of course, played by the great Raymond Burr. And who is Raymond Burr's adversary? Hamilton Burger. Now, by the way, it only occurred to me since I worked on this lecture to put this together, you know, Hamilton Burger never won. So, are you kidding me? Perry Mason made hamburger out of Hamilton Burger. That just hit me, that his name was Hamilton Burger. Hamburger. Am I the only one? Did you all know that? It just hit me. Anyway, the point is I thought it was a great, again, visual version of the actor played Hamilton Burger. But yes, this is what became. Fred and Barney become house husbands. But the worst, and then, of course, the whole gang is added to the car. But to me, the real crime of what happened was the killing of Betty and Wilma's unique, spunky, individual personalities. Of course they were housewives before the kids. They did the laundry. They did the dishes. But they had personality. They had spunk. I mean, an image like this when they yelled, "Charge it," when they were out shopping. And how about when they danced? I mean, they were able to cut a rug. You never saw images like this after they had kids. After they had kids, they became ciphers. In the great American anonymous baby boom generation that this image deconstructively represents. And I, for one, am a little angry about it. Anyway, yeah, I think there was a conspiracy by those kids to bring down the Flintstones. And how did they do it? Remember this episode in the last season when they sing that song, "Let the Sun Shine In"? which I'm sure everybody has a soft spot for. By the way, Hollywood Palace, once again, was a knockoff of the new ABC variety show Hollywood Palace, so it became Holly Rock Palace. But there are the kids taking over the show, doing their song, and this is no different than when Charles Schulz allowed Snoopy to take over Peanuts. Also in the same year, 1965, the moment he put Snoopy on top of that doghouse fighting the Red Baron, that's when Charlie Brown jumped the shark. I'm sorry. But Peanuts was never the same again. Anyway, after this, basically, it was all downhill. By the last season, ABC had canceled the show. Hanna-Barbera were left with a few other successes. They had done the Jetsons in 1963. That was not as successful as the Flintstones, but we still remember the Jetsons, but never quite got to the Flintstones. Johnny Quest starts out in prime time in 1964. Also doesn't last on the evenings like the Flintstones. By the last season, they introduced, characters like Gazoo. I mean, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me, Hanna-Barbera? Really? But the only admirable thing about Gazoo was the fact that it was voiced by the great Harvey Korman, shown here getting an Emmy for his work on the Carol Burnett Show with the great Tim Conway. And this is an example of the attitude that the general public had towards the Flintstones. From TV Guide, once again, the cartoon at the bottom reads, "And if a rating service calls, you can be the one to tell them we're watching the Flintstones." So again, it became this sort of secret pleasure, but people didn't admit to watching the Flintstones because it was a cartoon. Anyway, the show goes off the air in '66. Hanna-Barbera tries a full-length feature film, kind of a spoof on the James Bond thing. By that time, in 1966, the Bond craze was already kind of over. So, and it recalled their own Jay Bonrock episode. So instead of Madam Yes, they had some, a femme fatale character there. Maybe their biggest success other than the Flintstones, after the Flintstones, was Space Ghost in '66. In '67, they animate the Flintstones for an Anheuser-Busch promotional animation. That's nothing to write home about. The '70s hit, they try making Pebbles and Bam-Bam adult stars. That comes and goes. Their most audacious attempt following the Flintstones was 1972's Wait Till Your Father Gets Home, which was really an adult sitcom, also at night. It lasted a whole 2 seasons before Hanna-Barbera canceled, and that was based more on All in the Family in the same way the Flintstones was based on the Honeymooners. But it's really the merchandising, starting with the vitamins, that have given the Flintstones a kind of a second life. Look at these ads from the early '70s of the Flintstones. And, the artwork in these ads is never as good as the original artwork on the commercials. And then, of course, there's the Flintstone cereal that they've been hawking since the late '70s. Then the next trend became to babyfy everything, or whatever you call it, juvenile everything. And this became the Flintstones Kids, which was a shoot off of the vitamins. I, for one, am going on record, I hated those Flintstone Kids. Are you kidding me? Anyway, this was all that survived into the '70s and into the '80s. It wasn't until the late '70s that I noticed the underground cartoonist Bill Griffith in one of his comics about Zippy the Pinhead. Now, remember I showed you early on, he's still doing Zippy the Pinhead, but in 1979, he was maybe the first cartoonist to begin to use the Flintstones in a kind of a deconstructive way. So this is 1979. Then in 1981, a single is released by 2 guys in Baltimore, and I don't know if anybody's heard this. I couldn't fit it on my system is such that I can't run a song while I'm running a video. The point is, I wanted to play this for you. You should Google it. It's hilarious. It's basically Bruce Springsteen doing the Flintstones thing. So it's like, I was crossing the back streets of Bedrock as the music is building, and then, I was yelling, Wilma! And I'm doing my best Bruce Springsteen. But anyway, you can see that they did a beautiful knockoff of the classic Born to Run album cover from 1975. Then here's another cartoonist, J.D. King, doing a kind of a musical take with, Fred Zeppelin is supposed to be the Flintstones as rock stars. You begin to see in the culture, this is the illustrator Ward Sutton, you begin to see what I call dirty Flintstones art in the 80s and in the 90s, up to even Screw magazine, with all the bad parts, of course, blackened out. But with Baby Boomer magazine appearing in the early 90s, the Flintstone was stamped as the Baby Boomers cartoon. So at the same time you're getting kind of saccharine versions of the Flintstones, out in the further reaches of pop culture, you're seeing images of this kind of ugly Flintstones, but at the same time, you're getting the merchandising of the cleaned up Flintstones hawking products. So you can get the great John Crickfalusi, the animator, doing Flintstones. So everybody loves the Flintstones. He's, of course, the man behind Ren and Stimpy. But perhaps the greatest influence on cartoons of the Flintstones is Matt Groening's The Simpsons. Beginning with the fact that the hammock, everything, there's nothing Homer Simpson did that you can't find Fred also doing. Laying on the couch with the remote control, there's an image of Fred doing it. The Simpsons having an episode with Fred, where Homer has his double. Well, of course, there were multiple Flintstones episodes with Fred's double. Maybe my favorite being the one, Yabba Dabba Doo. Yabba Dabba Doo. But the Simpsons did their version of that. And by the way, here's a quick 1-minute clip compilation, of, wait, sorry, I'm trying to get that on the right thing. Okay, there we go. All the Simpsons knockoffs.
Very good, Bart. You have first choice of toys for free play.
Cool. I call the Flintstone phone.
Yabba dabba doo. I like talking to you.
Coming up next, the Flintstones meet the Jetsons.
Uh-oh. I smell another cheap cartoon crossover.
Okay, maybe my dad did steal Itchy, but so what? Animation is built on plagiarism. If it weren't for someone plagiarizing the Honeymooners, we wouldn't have the Flintstones.
It's my favorite.
Yabba dabba doo. Simpson, Homer Simpson, he's the greatest guy in history. From the town of Springfield, he's about to hit a chestnut tree.
Anyway, there's absolutely more. But of course, The Simpsons gives way to Family Guy, which has also done its share of Flintstones knockoffs. The basic relationship is, again, based on the original Fred and Wilma relationship. Some of the spoofs, I could have shown you a spoof, but there might have been children here. Their spoofs were a little bit on the dirtier side, of course, than The Simpsons. But you can tell that creator Seth MacFarlane has a real love for the Flintstones on these clips, if you know your Family Guy. Then, of course, Family Guy gave way to American Dad, which we can again see the Fred and Wilma relationship played out in a different version. And the bottom line is, there's nothing that the Simpsons have done, there's nothing the Family's done. They've all been Santa Claus, but of course, Fred was the first sort of modern cartoon Santa Claus before all those other cartoon shows. Speaking of dreams come true, people now are creating Flintstones environments. This is a sign of how much the Flintstones love. These aren't actually sanctioned by Hanna-Barbera. I think these are private enterprises around the country. By the way, there's more than one of these where people are trying to build real Flintstones Bedrock locations. Yeah, if that doesn't give you nightmares, I don't know what will. But I mean, look, they're making the actual three-dimensional cars, which is pretty good if you look at the early Barney Rubble-mobile there. And I mean, they're making real Flintstones homes. I mean, you know, God bless the internet, because this is the stuff you find. I mean, it's a whole complex. And look, it really looks pretty accurate to the original Bedrock. Now, I'm not making this up. This next image you're looking at is an actual California home based on the Flintstones. If you look at the home, it was dubbed the Flintstones home. And who just sold this home? Dick Clark. It's Dick Clark's house, one of his houses, I suppose. But yes, so there's a real Flintstones house. This is not the only DC that loves the Flintstones, because DC Comics, as I was telling you earlier when we were talking, is doing a kind of a realistic comic version of the Flintstones. Now, I don't know if you read this dialogue, but this is a realistic Fred worrying about if Wilma will still love him. Marriage is like insurance. You only enter into a lifetime commitment because you're afraid of the future. But does being married mean she will love me forever? Or is it just my attempt to keep... I mean, do I have to go on? Is this what we want in our modern comic Flintstones? No. But luckily, DC seems to be doing an alternate version where you can see they're still paying homage to the original Ed Benedict designs, which brings us basically to the real reason why the Flintstones are successful after all these years, why we still remember them and love them. It's the voices that brought them to life. This is one of the few color photographs I could find of the major four players. First among them being Alan Reed. That's Hoyt Curtin behind him, the music conductor. But Alan Reed even looked like Fred Flintstone, like a live-action version. And he was an actor. He was in a lot of things. He was in Breakfast at Tiffany's. He was in El Cid. He played Pancho Villa. I mean, he had a career while the Flintstones were going on. He did a lot of bit parts, character actor thing. Remember, I was watching some sitcom from the mid-'60s, and all of a sudden I see Alan Reed doing a little, guest shot as some character. But you can see that he really lived the role. I mean, he was Fred Flintstone. And that's why that voice, when you hear it, is what makes the Flintstones great. It's that voice. And how can you ever get a better Wilma? Since these actors have passed away, you know that all that Hollywood can do is find actors. It's like Bugs Bunny. You can always hear it. You know it's not Mel Blanc. It's somebody trying to do Mel Blanc. God bless him, but the bottom line is there will never be another Alan Reed and a Jean Vanderpyle. I mean, she, again, with that Fred, that voice that you know as Wilma's. She also did the voice of Pebbles, by the way. That baby voice is also Jean Vanderpyle. Then, of course, you have the great Mel Blanc. I mean, we can do a whole lecture, obviously, on Mel Blanc, but for those that you don't know, Mel Blanc was the voice of all the Warner Brothers cartoon characters and so many others. But Barney, because of Barney's ubiquity, has to be among his greatest voices. Here's a shot of there's a Barbera there sitting down. There is Mel Blanc in the center, Jean Vanderpyle. And then this figure in the background that you can see on our left there, there's Mel Blanc sitting down. Alan Reed is behind this gentleman. But that woman there is the fourth great voice, Bea Benaderet of Betty. And you might know her because she left the Flintstones in 1963 to join the new show Petticoat Junction, which lasted, I think, until 1970. And that's why the later voice of Betty is really this woman, Jerry. It's very indistinctive. It doesn't have that, oh, Barney, that Bea Benaderet voice that we love. So you have to go back to the original Flintstone end credits to find a credit for Bea Benaderet, because with the new ending that I showed you before, there's no Bea Benaderet there. But, so yeah, there's the end credits. And of course, the Flintstones were a Hanna-Barbera production. And that, in the end, is why we're here, is because of the great Hanna-Barbera and their vision to put this TV show together that we're all here to celebrate. So I can't find a better ending than to end it with the great ending of the Flintstones that we all know and love.
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. They're the modern Stone Age family. From the town of Bedrock, they're a page right out of history. Someday, maybe Fred will win the fight. Then that cat will stay out for the night. When you're with the Flintstones, have a yabba dabba do time. A dabba do time. We'll have a gay old time.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end. I just want to add a little coda. This is the current invitation, but I based it on the invitation that I did 23 years ago, which I'm holding in my hand here. That was the front. It's die cut, and there's the back to look like a little stone tablet to come to the Art Directors Club. But I was only able to do that lecture at the Art Directors Club because my friend Fred Seibert, sitting in the back, financed the show 23 years ago. And I can't tell you what it means to me to be here 23 years later. I'm getting verklempt. But to see Fred sitting in the back there not only to have all you here, but to have Fred there means the world to me. So thank you, Fred. Anyway, that's my logo for all my other comics history projects. I based it on, of course, the DC Comics logo. It took me many years, but I finally got around to it. My book that the museum has here, I'll be signing copies. It's a comic book art history book, and I take out the original dialogue and I put the words of the artist talking about the art. So you read the book like a giant comic book, but it's an art book and a history book. You should be buying one for your son there. Yeah, you better. Anyway, I'm doing a lecture at the end of May in White Plains, if you go to my website. Next week, I'll be in Waterbury, Connecticut, at this comic convention, doing my lecture on the 25th anniversary of the Batman animated series, 25 years of that. There are flyers out by the table of my illustration. I do comic book style art, but for magazines and advertising. I turn people into superheroes. And there are some of my posters and things for sale. Again, if you email me, there are my business cards, everything out there. Facebook friend me, go to my website. You'll see all the stuff about my Twilight Zone works, my Springsteen works. Facebook friend me, I run a Facebook comic history group on Jack Kirby, one on Neil Adams, and one on the Silver Age of comic book art. So, can we open it up to a little Q&A? Do we have time? And then after we do a Q&A, we'll go to the table or whatever the protocol is. But thank you, everybody, for being here. And should we take some questions? Or don't be bashful. Yes?
You mentioned that the Flintstones started around prime time in 1960?
Say that again?
1960 was prime time?
Yes, 1960.
How many people back then, Arlen, if you know, actually had color TV? Was the show originally done in color, black and white?
You know, that I wouldn't know, because most TV shows up until 1966 were in black and white. Very few things were in color. So,
shows were the Hanna-Barbera original
yeah, no, I'm not.
were done in black and white or color.
You see, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But yeah, you have to be a real Hanna-Barbera. I mean, listen, I know my Flintstones, but I wouldn't pretend at all that I'm a real animation buff. There are men like Jerry Beck and people like that that really know their Hanna-Barbera history. What's his name? Scott Shaw would be a person to go to. Yes?
We didn't have color television until the early mid-70s, but it didn't stop us from watching, so you didn't really know.
Right.
Care. It was just
Right. Oh yeah, I had a black and white TV until 1969. I watched the entire Batman series, and I knew it was in color, but I knew of it as a black and white show. So yeah, we take color for granted, but you know, that was black and white in those days.
What do you think you can attribute the success way outliving the cartoon with the merchandise? Why has the merchandise continued to be successful?
Well,
Despite the fact that the cartoon hasn't been on.
that's the power of merchandising. That people know the Flintstones from the vitamins, from, you tell me. I mean, it has to be from some of the merchandising. But yeah, I mean, in lieu of the show itself, merchandise can keep something alive. Because the bottom line is, it's a big pop culture soup. Whether it's an original show, whether it's a toy, whether it's a video game, as long as it's out, that means it's known. You know? But yeah, it is a little sad that, you know, people might only know the Flintstones from vitamins or, you know, from whatever they might see. But
You know, it's interesting. There's been plenty of toys and merchandise that has tried to cross over into television and cartoon characters. It has been like G.I. Joe's, for example. They were never able to make a successful cartoon out of that.
you know, there's no rhyme or believe me, if somebody knew the rhyme or reason, everything would be successful. There wouldn't be failures. But yeah, some shows are great with merchandise, but the content of the show is lousy. Like G.I. Joe never had a good show. The toy was great, but we would have loved it back then when I was a kid buying G.I. Joe. If there was like a dramatic, even an animated show, we would have died for that. So yeah, it's like sometimes you get one or the other, but not always both. You know? By the way, that should be the least of our problems with our white privilege. You know, oh, our cartoons aren't as good as our products. You know, while the rest of the world is going to hell, you know, that's our biggest problem. But yes. Okay, I'm a little hard of hearing, so either somebody translate for me or speak a little louder.
What she's asking is, when they did the voiceovers, were they watching the animation and voicing to the animation, or were they reading from the
I think you saw from some of those shots, I think they were in a recording studio, kind of like the days of radio, where all the actors were there together, and they read, like they ran through the script. Maybe that's why it's so great. But you know, you look at a TV show, does anybody watch Archer? Okay, Archer's a great show. It's very witty, but you know, I just heard an interview with one of the voice actors. All of that dialogue is overlapping. It sounds like they're all in the same room, right? But guess what? They're not in the same room. The script is tightly written. They record their parts separately from their homes, and the editors put it all together with the overlap. Look at Seth MacFarlane. He's the voice of both Peter Griffin and Brian Griffin and Stewie. So when they're having conversations, I'm assuming that's Seth MacFarlane reading all the parts of one and then all the parts of the other, and then in editing they put it together, but it sounds like it's live and they're bouncing it off. But I think the Flintstones was done at a time where it was like radio, where they were all together in the same room recording it. Well, again, I'm not sure. Fred might know. No.
They're actually not even all together. They did all their lines one at a time.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, and there were storyboards.
Right.
But they were reading scripts.
The animation would come after.
Yeah. They make the animation do the voice. Right. Yeah, whereas Seth does everything with all of his crew there live, and he does all the parts in real time.
Wow.
He bounces off of himself.
Wow. Yeah. See, that's what I'm saying. To keep it sounding fresh, you know, actors talk about it all the time, like they need that other actor to kind of help them. So that's how they do it.
Animation, they generally don't do that. Seth does it. He's relatively.
But maybe that's why Seth's stuff is so great, is because he brought back that kind of feeling. Yeah.
First, thank you.
Thank you.
Super comprehensive Flintstones. More than I needed. I think I ever thought I would have.
You know, my big promo line to the museum was, they asked me, Arlen, do you want to give a promo line we could use? I said, tell people that if they think they know the Flintstones or they love the Flintstones, which we all do, come and see me, and I have a feeling you'll walk out, you'll still love it, but you'll love it maybe more, and maybe you'll see aspects of it you didn't see. So thank you for that.
You mentioned in the beginning BC as an inspiration. I'm curious of the inspiration. What was going on in culture at the time? Cavemen would seem viable.
Okay. Well, I tried to show you not only had a comic strip history of cavemen being in the modern times with Alley-Oop. BC came out in 1958 and was a success right away. That was 2 years before the Flintstones. Again, when everybody talks about the Honeymooners, how can they avoid BC, which was basically the Flintstones? So you have the Honeymooners, you've got BC, you've got the history of the comic strip, you've got the fact that Ed Benedict made that cartoon that I showed about Texas during the Stone Age. You put it all into a cauldron, and you get the... Supposedly, Hanna-Barbera, they tried a family set in Roman times. They tried a set in, like, Puritan times, you know, with the big tri-cornered hats and all that. And lo and behold, the Stone Age thing won out. But again, whether they admitted it or not, they had precedents for Stone Age / modern comedy. Look, that Superman cover I showed you, you know, was Lois Lane dressed up, you know, writing the Stone Age. So this motif of taking the Stone Age and doing it in modern lingo, you know, was around, and they just put, like I said, they mixed it with the Honeymoon. By the way, I have a great quote to read you about the Honeymooners that I forgot to read, but they asked, when it was brought up, remember, right in that ABC meeting, they said, this is too much like the Honeymooners. But listen to what they said about Jackie Gleason. In a 1986 Playboy interview, Jackie Gleason said Alan Reed had done voiceovers for Gleason in his early movies, and Gleason considered suing Hanna-Barbera for copying the Honeymooners, but decided to let it pass. According to Henry Corden, a voice actor and a friend of Gleason's, Jackie's lawyers told him he could probably have the Flintstones pulled right off the air. But they also told him, do you want to be known as the guy who yanked Fred Flintstone off the air? The guy who took away a show so many kids love and so many parents love too? So basically, yeah, he could have sued and he chose not to.